Welcome to Tips and Tricks for your cover stitches. I'm Doris Breckbuhl, educator and overlock specialist at Bernina International. In this video you will see how the different settings contribute to the perfect stitches for your project. In the description below you'll find an overview of the different chapters in this video so that you can easily navigate to those topics that interest you most. Let's have a look at optimization for cover and chain stitch. If you want to approach stitch optimization with a neutral perspective, I recommend you sew some samples, playing with thread tensions. For example, adjusting the chain looper tension from 4 to 1 to 9, adjusting the right needle thread tension, looks good on the upper side, slightly different on the underside of the stitch. Same with the center needle thread tension, slightly different. Also with the left needle thread tension, very different on different settings. And you may want to consider that your fabric behaves differently whether you sew along the grain or across the grain. But now let's have a look at the sample where we can optimize. I have set the machine for 4-thread cover stitch using a texturized thread in the looper. The tensions are set to default 444, stitch length at 3, differential feed at 1, presser foot pressure at medium. Fabric, needles and thread influence the stitch. Therefore, when optimizing, the rule is to always decrease one tension first before increasing another. But we start test sewing with the defaults, which you find on the stitch chart. Use the fabric you're using for your project. Evaluate the stitch for its looks and function. Looks okay on the upper side, but the looper thread is too tight. So first, decrease one tension. Let's decrease the looper thread. Slightly better, but not enough. I decrease the looper thread tension further. Getting better, but now I'm already down at 1, which means I can increase the right needle thread a bit to pull more on the looper thread. It is a bit better. I will also increase the left needle thread a bit. That's more what I expect it to be. I will increase the right needle thread tension a little bit more. So my stitch looks better, more to what I expect it to be, but it's not as stretchy anymore. So to increase the stretch, I can decrease the stitch length. And that looks much nicer. Shorter stitches will bring more looper and needle thread into the stitch and give a better result. I recommend increasing the needle thread tension only slightly and in steps if needed, not to lose elasticity of your stitch where needed. And now I'll come to 2 tips. This sewing sample looks more or less good on the upper side, but what happened here? If a thread is very loose, it may not be the tension you need to check and adjust, it might be your threading path. Here, I lost my thread from the pre-tension. So correct threading can also avoid a mistake. And one more sample, looking more or less good on the upper side, but also not so nice on the underside of the stitch. Here, by mistake, I had my presser foot down when threading, so the thread was not between the tension discs, only laying over it. So it's loose and irregular. Always have the presser foot up for threading to avoid such results. Chain stitch is a different story. Here I used it on a fine taffeta with embroidery thread in needle and looper. And you see the seam is puckering. To optimize this, I decreased needle thread tension and looper thread tension, and I shortened the stitches. And you see it's quite a difference. Shortening the stitches on the chain stitch will also give it a little bit more elasticity. Another option to optimize a chain stitch on a fine woven fabric would be setting the differential feed between 1 and 0.7 to stretch the fabric under the foot. That depends on your fabric quality. This sewing test shows you a wide cover stitch in a fine knit. It looks very nice, but is it stretchy enough? It's not. So if the needle threads break, we can decrease tension if that helps. The other option is also shortening the stitch length, bringing more thread into the stitch and the seam to add elasticity. These are the possibilities for stretchy materials. And my tip for sewing with decorative threads. Reduce the sewing speed, so slower but regular. It's easy using the speed slider to reduce the max speed. That gives you the best results. The stitch length. The stitch length has a very big impact on your project and on your sewing result. Determine the optimal stitch length with your sewing test. It may be different when using a woven fabric or when sewing on a knit or jersey fabric. We use a longer stitch for decorative threads or heavier fabrics. Also a chain stitch with a longer stitch length may look nicer. Should you have a soft knit waving out, a longer stitch may solve the problem, still offering you the stretch you want. On the other hand, a longer stitch or shorter stitch may be useful for a knit. Define it with your sewing test. Always use a shorter stitch when sewing highly stretchy materials. What is differential feed? For me, definitely the biggest difference of an overlock or cover stitch machine to a sewing machine. How it works and what it does to your fabric, let's have a look. When I detach the presser foot, you can better see what differential feed is. The feed tug of an overlock or cover stitch machine consists of two parts, the front part and the rear part. And with differential feed, we adjust the movement of the front part. At differential feed 1, both parts move the same distance and the same speed. When I reduce differential feed to between 1 and 0.7, the front part makes a smaller movement, stretching the fabric under the needle. When I set differential feed between 1 and 2, it makes a bigger movement. The front feed tug makes a bigger movement, bringing more fabric towards the needle. And what it does with your fabric is this. And I recommend you sew a sample for yourself using a soft knit. I'm using a narrow cover stitch, have tensions at default, stitch length at 3 and differential feed at 1 for the beginning. And you can see the fabric is transported more or less flat. If I adjust differential feed towards 0.7, you notice the fabric is waving out, being stretched under the presser foot. And if I adjust towards 1.5 and 2, my fabric is gathering. How much depends on your fabric quality. But as mentioned, I recommend you sew yourself an example. That means if you have seam puckering, for example here, with the fine woven fabric and the chain stitch, I recommend you set differential feed between 1 and 0.7. I set it directly to 0.7, and it works also with cover stitch, not only with chain stitch. And you can compare seam puckering and a flat seam. On the other hand, if your result is a soft knit with waving out effect, you can adjust your differential feed towards 1.3 maybe, definitely more than 1, and see the flat result. Maybe 1.2 is enough. Achieving a nice result with the suitable differential feed setting. For intentional gathering, like this. You set differential feed to 2. For optimal gathering, you also adjust the stitch length to max. That's how you can gather fine fabrics. Suitable for gathering are chain stitch and narrow cover stitch, fine and soft fabrics. With this, you achieve the best results. And that's what differential feed does for you. Presser foot pressure, but how much? Presser foot pressure is adjustable between low, medium and high. How we have to adjust it depends on our sewing test. For proper feeding, you can adjust presser foot pressure. A general rule is that soft, fine fabrics need less pressure for better feeding. Heavier fabrics are most often better fed with higher pressure. But really, only a sewing test will show you the difference. This sample with high pressure was not fed very nicely over the seam. Using lower pressure, it turned out very, very nice. And also, a tip is, when sewing in elastic, or when you stretch your fabric in front of the presser foot, increase presser foot pressure. And at the same time, when you increase presser foot pressure, when you stretch your project, increase the stitch length. But perform a sewing test to define the optimal setting for your project. And with this, you have seen that you have the total control over your stitches, your threads and your fabrics, whether it is with thread tensions or stitch length. And you have experienced that your differential feed can do much more than wave-free seams in knits and pucker-free seams in woven fabrics. Chain stitch is ideal for gathering, for hems, for decorative hems, for binding, or for decorative stitching in general. Cover stitch is ideal for hems with elastic, decorative hems as well as practical hems, flat joining seams, for example with lace or lace elastic, of course for top stitching, for binding and for decorative seams. I'm sure you can use your L620 cover stitch machine for many projects and many sewing techniques. You have now seen how the different settings contribute to your perfect stitch. If you like to learn more about the Bernina L620, click on the link for more videos. And if one of the tips has been helpful, give us a like. We would love it if you subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Bernina, made to create.